Hello and welcome. My name is Nigel McDowell and I'm a photographer within Creative and Campaign Services at Ulster University. So we're going to carry out some product photography within a home environment, initially using daylight and then using flash in the second half. For my location, I've chosen a room with plain walls and light coming from two windows. One to my right, which will act as my main light for the product, and one behind me which will act as a fill light. Trying to use a room with neutral coloured walls to avoid any colour casts and avoid mixing your light sources, so stick to daylight and turn off any tungsten lights, any fluorescence, any overhead lights. You will need a camera which allows you manual control over exposure in terms of shutter speed and aperture. Here you want to use M for manual exposure, meaning you will set the shutter speed and the aperture to obtain the correct exposure. In these circumstances I would forget about the other exposure modes: aperture priority, shutter priority, P for program. Those are all automatic exposure modes, and to be honest, if you're going to be shooting say on a white background, your meter's not always going to give you a good exposure on automatic. A tripod's essential if you're using natural light, as you will be shooting at slowish shutter speeds that you wouldn't normally be using when you're outside taking photographs. Another big advantage of having the tripod mounted camera is that you can leave your image composed and you can walk away from the camera, you can walk over to your subject, you can move it and walk back to the camera without having to recompose, and you have more consistency in terms of composition if you're say doing a dozen photographs, different products. If you have access to a remote release such as this, it'll help you to avoid camera shake at the slow shutter speeds. If you can't use one, then use the self timer option in your camera. Go into the menu, find the option for self timer, and this means that when you press the button to take the photograph, there's a delay before the photograph's taken, and that delay gives us time to let the camera stabilize. ISO controls the camera's sensitivity to light. Lower ISO means better quality. Higher ISO will result in some noise and grain coming into your photographs depending on the camera. We have no reason to use a high ISO, as we can just compensate for a good exposure by selecting a slow shutter speed. Our subject's not moving and our camera's on a tripod, so it doesn't matter whether we use a 60th of a second or 3 seconds. Choosing an image size, small, medium, high, I would always choose large. It's very easy to downsize a large image to something smaller for the web, for instance, but if you shoot small, you cannot increase that resolution to obtain a large image. In terms of file format, JPEG tends to be what most people would use. It's what everybody's used to. But there also is an option called RAW. And RAW really is for people who prefer to have more control over the look of their image and to process that photograph in their computer. Downside of that is you will need some software that can read a raw image. You can't just give a raw image to somebody, they won't be able to view it. So you need Photoshop or some other software to process the raw image. You can think of it as RAW as a digital negative. The processing can be interpreted different ways by different people. Here I'm making sure the camera flash is set to off. Don't want to use direct flash or built-in flash in the camera. It's always going to give a very amateurish look. The aperture within the lens controls both the amount of light coming into the camera but also the amount of the subject that's in focus, and that's known as depth of field. How wide do you use? 2.8, or do you stop right down to f16? I tend to choose an aperture midway around f11, and that will ensure that all of your subjects in focus. So once we have selected an aperture, shutter speeds then adjusted until correct exposure is achieved. It'll usually be on the slower side, 1/4 of a second, 1/2 a second, and that's fine because we're on a tripod and we're using a self timer and the subject's not moving, so really shutter speed is irrelevant as long as we can use that to obtain correct exposure. Keeping to the mantra that manual is better in this case, it's better not to leave the white balance setting on automatic. If you need consistency from photograph to photograph. So here I'm setting a custom white balance by placing a neutral grey card or sheet of white paper until it fills the camera frame, and then we can use the camera to set a reference point and store that. Here I'm simply carrying out a manual white balance on a DSLR, in this case a Canon 5D. Be aware that if you're shooting throughout the day over a period of hours, light is going to change in terms of quantity and also in terms of color temperature. So it could be cool, it could be warm, depending whether it's sunny, cloudy. So you might want to repeat your manual white balance as you go along. In terms of focusing, you can focus through the eyepiece or via the live screen on the camera. Here I'm using what's known as a single point focus. It means I can move that single point around the subject and tell the camera that's where I want to focus. It's always good to zoom into the preview and check the focus as you shoot. It's pretty standard procedure to use what's known as a roll of seamless paper for this type of photography. White tends to be a good choice, although if you're shooting white subjects you're not going to have much contrast, so you do want some contrast between your subjects. If they're white, use a darker background and so on. I've improvised here by using a roll of lining paper from B&Q. Flashes come in many guises and different power outputs for different purposes, but we don't need a lot of power for this particular work, so any small speed light such as this Godox V1 on the left will suffice. It's great if we can use the flash off the camera. Sometimes the worst place to put a flash is on the camera on the hot shoe. So I'm going to put mine on a light stand using this bracket, which will allow us to add a light modifier such as an umbrella. This is going to soften the light and soften the shadows. A light modifier can be anything that changes the direct output of the flash, such as a simple umbrella, softbox, even a white wall or a ceiling can be a modifier. If you bounce the flash off them, you'll get a softer light instead of those harsh shadows. Once this is set up, you'll want a trigger to control the flash, to talk to the flash and control the power. And the trigger sits in your camera's hot shoe, and you can dial in the flash power setting that you need without having to physically reach up to the flash each time and turn it up and down. Here I've set my flash left of camera, and I'm using a neutral white box to the right to bounce some of the light from the flash gun back into the right hand side of the product. Moving on slightly, I've now placed a flash in a small softbox and placed it directly above my product, which is a fairly standard setup. I'm using a C-stand with a boom arm so I can maneuver the flash directly overhead, and I can still keep the main stand out of the shot of the camera. Using a fixed lighting setup such as this, it's very easy to get consistent, repeatable results, and you can get through a lot of photography within a short space of time.